They are two stars now that will always lead us forward. Thank you.
She is more than an employer. She is the guardian of your most precious treasure, the person you entrust with the safety of your children in the sanctuary of your own home. She becomes a part of the family, a second mother whose hands you pay to feed, to soothe, and to protect. You give her your trust, absolutely and without question. But what happens when that trust is a fatal mistake? What if the quiet, smiling woman you welcomed into your family's heart is hiding a mind curling with resentment? And what if the hands you pay to protect are the same hands that reach for a kitchen knife when you are not looking? To the outside world, Marina and Kevin Krim were living the New York City dream. They had a beautiful family and a sprawling, luxurious apartment on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. Their lives revolved around their three bright, beautiful children: 6-year-old Lucia, affectionately known as Lulu, 2-year-old Leo, and 3-year-old Nessie. To help manage their busy lives, they hired a nanny, a 50-year-old woman from the Dominican Republic named Yoselyn Ortega. For 2 years, Ortega was a fixture in their home. She was quiet, reliable, and the children seemed to love her. The Krims treated her like family, even paying for her to fly home and joining her on a family vacation. They believed she was a loving, dedicated caregiver. They had no idea they were sharing their home with a ticking time bomb of envy and rage. The afternoon of October 25, 2012, was the day the dream became an unimaginable nightmare. Marina Krim had taken her middle child, Nessie, to a swimming lesson and had arranged to meet Ortega with Lulu and Leo there afterward. But they never showed up. Confused, Marina sent a text to Ortega. There was no reply. A knot of unease began to tighten in her stomach. She rushed back to their apartment building, the silence of the elevator amplifying her growing dread. When she opened the door, the apartment was dark and eerily quiet. She called out their names. Nothing. As she walked through the silent rooms, she saw a faint light coming from under the master bathroom door. The real horror of her life was waiting for her on the other side of that door. What she saw was a scene of such primal, unspeakable horror that it would be seared into the public consciousness forever. The pristine white bathroom was a slaughterhouse, drenched in blood. In the bathtub lay the small, lifeless bodies of her two beautiful children, Lulu and Leo. Their eyes were open, their bodies riddled with deep, savage stab wounds. Standing over them, a bloody kitchen knife in her hand, was Yoselyn Ortega. As Marina watched in a state of shock beyond terror, the nanny plunged the knife into her own throat in a last, desperate act of violence. The scream that erupted from Marina Krim was not human. It was the sound of a soul being shattered, a primal roar of agony that alerted the entire building that a monster had been unleashed. The investigation and trial revealed a motive that was as chilling as the crime itself. This was not a sudden, random psychotic break. It was the culmination of a slow-burning, venomous resentment. Ortega's life was falling apart. She was drowning in financial problems and had recently been forced to move her own son out of their apartment and back into her sister's cramped home in the Bronx. Every day, she would leave her own troubled reality and walk into the Krim's world of affluence and happiness. She grew to hate them for it. She was jealous of Marina, who she felt was the perfect mother with the perfect life. She complained to her family that the Krims were working her too hard and that they demanded she act as a housekeeper in addition to a nanny. The envy festered, the resentment grew, and in her twisted mind, the children became the symbols of a life she could never have. And so, she decided to destroy them. At her trial, Ortega's defense lawyers argued that she was legally insane, that she was suffering from a severe psychosis and had been hearing voices that commanded her to kill. But the prosecution painted a different picture. They argued that this was a calculated, deliberate act of revenge committed by a woman consumed by pure hatred. They detailed the brutality of the attack. Lulu, who was old enough to understand what was happening, had fought for her life, her small body covered in defensive wounds. Leo had been stabbed so violently that his throat was cut to the bone. This was not the work of a detached mind. It was the work of a furious, vengeful killer. The jury agreed. In 2018, after a harrowing 6-week trial, Yoselyn Ortega was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced her to the maximum penalty, life in prison, without the possibility of parole. The skies crashed on the shoulder. "You are a pure evil," he told her, ensuring she would never again see the outside of a prison cell. As of Saturday, August 30th, 2025, Yoselyn Ortega is incarcerated at the Bedford Hills Correctional Facility for Women in New York, where she will die. In an act of incredible strength and resilience, the Krim family founded the Lulu and Leo Fund, a charity that promotes creativity in children, ensuring their children's names are remembered for the light they brought into the world, not the darkness that took them out of it. But the story of Yoselyn Ortega remains a permanent scar, a horrifying testament to the monster who can hide behind the mask of a caregiver and the ultimate parental nightmare come to life.
Is the defendant guilty or not guilty?
Guilty.
Guilty of what?
Guilty of murder in the second degree.
Why did they do that to me? Why did they do that to me?
The au pair. The very concept is built on a foundation of youthful optimism and trust. A young woman arrives from a foreign land, not just as an employee, but as a temporary family member, a cultural big sister to your children. You welcome her into your home, believing her innocence is a guarantee of her kindness. But what happens when that innocence becomes the centerpiece of an international murder trial? What if the big sister you trusted is accused of a crime so brutal it sparks a firestorm of debate? And what if, in the end, no one can agree on whether she is a monster or a victim of a terrible injustice? In 1996, Sunil and Deborah Eppen, 2 highly respected doctors living in a peaceful Boston suburb, hired 19-year-old Louise Woodward. She was a fresh-faced, seemingly cheerful young woman from a small town in England, looking for a year of adventure in America. To the Eppens, she seemed like the perfect person to care for their 2 young sons, Brendan and 8-month-old Matthew. It was a standard arrangement, a portrait of modern family life repeated in thousands of homes. But within months, this picture-perfect scene would be shattered, and the Apens' home would become the epicenter of one of the most controversial legal battles of the 20th century. The unraveling began with a frantic 911 call on February 4th, 1997. It was Louise Woodward. She told the dispatcher that the baby in her care, Matthew Epen, was gasping for air and had gone limp. Paramedics arrived to find a scene of quiet terror. Matthew was unresponsive, his breathing shallow. He was rushed to Boston Children's Hospital, where doctors discovered a constellation of catastrophic injuries. He had a massive skull fracture, bleeding in his brain, and severe retinal hemorrhaging. To the medical experts, these were the classic, damning hallmarks of shaken baby syndrome. Their diagnosis was blunt and horrifying. This child had been violently shaken and slammed against a hard surface, and the only person with him when it happened was his au pair. The facade of the innocent English girl instantly evaporated. Louise Woodward was arrested and charged with the murder of Matthew Epen. The story she told police was a confusing jumble of inconsistencies. First, she claimed she had no idea what had happened. Then, under questioning, she admitted she might have been a little rough with Matthew. She told investigators she had popped him on the bed and that he may have hit his head. To prosecutors, this was a confession. They built their case around a simple, brutal narrative. Louise, a young and immature teenager, had grown frustrated with the fussy baby and resentful of the family's rules, including a strict curfew. In a moment of selfish, explosive rage, she had shaken him into a coma. The trial was not just a legal proceeding. It was a transatlantic war fought in the headlines. The American media portrayed her as a cold, callous killer, but in the United Kingdom, she became a national cause. The British tabloids painted her as a naive local girl being railroaded by an aggressive and flawed American justice system. Her family and friends started a campaign to free Louise, raising hundreds of thousands of dollars for her defense. The courtroom became a battleground, not just over her guilt, but over the very science of shaken baby syndrome, with world-renowned experts on both sides presenting completely contradictory testimony. The prosecution's doctors claimed Matthew's injuries were fresh and could only have been inflicted with immense force. The defense's experts argued the injury was weeks old, a pre-existing blood clot that had tragically re-bled on that fateful day. After weeks of grueling testimony, the jury delivered a verdict that sent a shockwave across the globe. They found Louise Woodward guilty of second-degree murder, a conviction that carried a mandatory sentence of life in prison. The image of the 19-year-old girl collapsing in tears, wailing, "Why did they do that to me?" was broadcast to a stunned world. In England, there was outrage. In America, many felt justice had been served. But the story took one final, unprecedented turn. The trial judge, Hiller Zobel, did something almost unheard of. 10 days after the verdict, in a stunning legal maneuver, he threw out the jury's murder conviction, citing the intense and frantic public atmosphere surrounding the trial. He declared that the circumstances in which the defendant acted were characterized by confusion, inexperience, frustration, immaturity, and some anger, but not malice. He reduced the charge to involuntary manslaughter and sentenced her to the 279 days she had already served in jail. Louise Woodward, convicted of killing a child, was set free. As of Saturday, August 30th, 2025, Louise Woodward is in her late 40s and lives a quiet life back in England. After her release, she graduated from law school and is now a mother herself, teaching dance classes in a small town. To this day, she maintains her absolute innocence. The Apan family, who lost their son, has always maintained that she is a killer who got away with murder. The case of the British au pair remains a raw, open wound in legal and medical history, leaving behind a legacy of doubt and a single, haunting question that can never be truly answered. Was she a naive young girl caught in a medical witch hunt, or a cunning, violent killer who played the system and walked free? A nanny is supposed to be a source of calm and stability, a gentle presence who helps to build a safe and nurturing world for your children. You trust them not just with your child's physical safety, but with their developing mind, believing they will fill it with kindness and care. But what happens when that nanny's own mind is a battleground for forces you cannot see? What if the voice they listen to is not yours, but a dark command that orders them to kill? And what if they decide to turn a bustling city street into a stage for an act of terror, so visually horrifying it feels ripped from a nightmare? In Moscow, Russia, the Meshcheryakov family believed they had found a godsend. Their 4-year-old daughter, Nastya, was a special needs child, suffering from cerebral palsy and epilepsy, and she required constant, dedicated care. They hired Gilchekra Bobakulova, a 38-year-old immigrant from Uzbekistan, to be her full-time nanny. For 3 years, Bobakulova was a professional and seemingly loving caregiver. The family trusted her completely, believing she was a compassionate woman who had a special bond with their vulnerable child. They had no idea she was hiding a long and severe history of schizophrenia, or that her mind was slowly being poisoned by extremist ideology. The family's world was annihilated on the morning of February 29, 2016. Nastya's parents left for work with their older son, leaving their daughter in the care of the woman they had trusted for years. Hours later, their ordinary day was shattered by an urgent phone call. Their apartment building was on fire. When emergency crews arrived, they found the apartment gutted by flames. But the fire was not the most horrific discovery. Inside, on the floor, they found the headless body of a small child. The horror then spilled out into the public square. As smoke billowed from the apartment, police began receiving frantic calls about a woman acting erratically outside the Oktyabrskoye Pole metro station. The reports were so bizarre, they were initially unbelievable. The woman, dressed in a black hijab, was screaming, and she was holding something in her hand. As police and onlookers got closer, the horrifying truth became clear. In her raised hand, Julchekra Bobakulova was holding the freshly hair of 4-year-old Nastia. For the next hour, in a spectacle of pure terror captured on dozens of cell phone videos, she paced in front of the station, holding the child's head aloft like a grotesque trophy. She screamed, "Allahu Akbar," and declared herself a terrorist. "I hate democracy," she yelled to the horrified crowd. "I am your death." She threatened to detonate a bomb, turning a public space into a hostage scene where the only hostage was the gruesome proof of the atrocity she had already committed. The image of the woman in black, brandishing the head of the child she was paid to protect, became an instant and unforgettable symbol of evil. She was not just a killer, she was a performer of terror. The investigation into her motive revealed a toxic and terrifying fusion of untreated mental illness and religious extremism. Bobakulova claimed she had murdered the little girl as revenge for Russia's airstrikes in Syria, an act of geopolitical vengeance. She told investigators that Allah ordered her to do it. The reality, however, was more complex. Authorities discovered that she had been diagnosed with schizophrenia years earlier in Uzbekistan, a fact she had hidden from the family. Her already fragile mind had been warped by an extremist boyfriend who had reportedly filled her head with radical ideology. She was not a trained terrorist, but a profoundly sick woman whose delusions had been twisted and weaponized, leading her to believe that murdering a disabled child was a righteous and holy act. Her trial focused entirely on her mental state. Was she a cold-blooded terrorist who deserved life in prison, or a woman so detached from reality that she could not be held criminally responsible for her actions? The courts ultimately decided on the latter. After extensive psychiatric evaluation, she was found to be legally insane, a paranoid schizophrenic who was not in control of her own mind when she committed the murder. Instead of being sent to prison, Golchekra Bobakulova was committed to a high-security psychiatric hospital for indefinite, compulsory treatment. As of Saturday, August 30th, 2025, she remains confined within a secure psychiatric facility in Russia. While her doctors report that her condition has been stabilized with medication, the prospect of her ever being released back into society is almost zero. Her crime was not one of simple greed, resentment, or rage. It was a horrifying eruption of a mind that had completely shattered, creating a monster whose actions defy all rational explanation. The case of the Moscow nanny is a chilling reminder that sometimes the most terrifying evil is the one that is born not from a wicked heart, but from a broken reality. We pray for heroes in moments of unimaginable crisis. When the world dissolves into chaos and fear, we look for a savior, a person of impossible courage who runs toward the danger that the rest of us flee from. The hero is a symbol of our best selves. But what if that heroism is nothing more than a performance? What if the craving for applause and admiration becomes a sickness, a dark and narcissistic hunger so profound that it can only be satisfied by creating a tragedy? What if the brave nanny you celebrate for surviving a deadly fire is actually the monster who lit the match, all for a twisted, fleeting moment in the spotlight? In the affluent New York suburb of Pound Ridge, William and Denise Fisher were building a perfect life. They had successful careers and a beautiful home, and their world was made complete with the birth of their daughter, Christy. To help them, They hired a 20-year-old au pair from Switzerland named Olivia Reiner. She seemed to be a gift from heaven. Her references were impeccable, her demeanor was professional, and she had a calm, confident presence that instantly put the new parents at ease. She was everything they could have possibly wanted in a caregiver, a woman they quickly came to trust with the most precious thing in their lives. They had no idea they had just welcomed a serial arsonist and a future killer into their home. The family's idyllic world was incinerated on the night of December 2nd, 1991. The Fishers were out for the evening, having left their 6-week-old daughter in the sole trusted care of Olivia Reiner. Later that night, a frantic 911 call reported a house fire at their address. When neighbors rushed outside, they saw a scene of pure terror. Flames were pouring from the Fishers' home. Then, out of the smoke, emerged Olivia Reiner. She was hysterical, her face stained with soot, her voice choked with panic. Her story was every parent's worst nightmare. She claimed a fire had erupted without warning, and she had tried desperately to fight through the thick black smoke to get to baby Christie's room, but the inferno was too intense, forcing her to flee for her own life. In the immediate aftermath, Reiner was treated as a hero, a tragic victim who had done everything she could. The community wrapped its arms around the brave young woman who had barely escaped with her own life. But when firefighters finally managed to extinguish the blaze, the narrative of a tragic accident began to crumble into ash. They found the body of baby Christie in her crib, seemingly a victim of the fire. The subsequent autopsy, however, revealed a horrifying and scientifically undeniable truth. The medical examiner found almost no soot or carbon monoxide in Christie's lungs. His conclusion was chilling and absolute. The baby had died from suffocation, and she had been dead for up to 30 minutes before the fire was even set. The fire was not the tragedy. It was a grotesque piece of theater designed to hide a murder. The heroic nanny was now the prime suspect in a homicide investigation. As detectives dug into Olivia Reiner's past, their investigation led them across the Atlantic to her home country of Switzerland. What they found there was a clear and terrifying pattern. This was not the first mysterious fire to occur on Olivia Reiner's watch. In fact, authorities linked her to at least 4 other suspicious blazes at homes where she had previously worked as a nanny. The horrifying picture was now complete. Olivia Reiner was not a hero. She was a serial arsonist who had escalated to murder. The trial exposed the depths of her chilling psychological disorder. Prosecutors argued that Reiner suffered from a dangerous hero complex, a form of Munchausen syndrome, where an individual fabricates a crisis so they can be hailed as a savior for resolving it. Her entire life was a performance, and she was the writer, director, and star. She craved attention, admiration, and the drama of being at the center of a tragedy. For years, she had satisfied this sick hunger by setting fires and then discovering them. But this time, it wasn't enough. To make her performance more believable, to make the tragedy more profound and the spotlight on her even brighter, she had deliberately suffocated the helpless infant in her care before lighting the match. Throughout the trial, Reiner's demeanor was unnervingly calm. She sat in court with a blank, emotionless expression, a cold and detached actress watching her final performance unfold. She showed no grief, no remorse, no fear. The jury saw her for what she was, a cold-blooded killer hiding behind a mask of sanity. In 1993, after deliberating for just a few hours, they found her guilty of second-degree murder and second-degree arson. The judge, sentencing her to the maximum of 25 years to life in prison, condemned her actions, calling the murder of a defenseless baby the ultimate crime of a depraved mind. As of Saturday, August 30th, 2025, Olivia Reiner is in her 50s and remains incarcerated at the Bedford Hills Correctional Facility for Women in New York, the very same prison that holds the killer nanny, Yoselyn Ortega. She has been denied parole on multiple occasions, with the board noting her shocking lack of remorse and the calculated, cruel nature of her crime. Her case is a deeply disturbing look at a psychological sickness that turns a desperate craving for attention into a murder weapon. A chilling reminder that sometimes the most dangerous monsters are the ones who are pretending to be heroes. There is a terrifying archetype of a killer known as the angel of death. They are the caregivers who, instead of healing, bring an end to life, often hiding their crimes behind the mysterious veil of natural causes. We imagine them in hospitals, but what if the angel of death is not a nurse in a starched uniform, but a simple babysitter from down the street? What if she is followed not by bad luck, but by a pattern of death so consistent and so horrifying that the world refuses to believe it until it's too late? This is the story of a serial killer who preyed on the helpless and whose greatest weapon was the world's sympathy. In the small, rural towns of Central Florida, Christine Folling was a familiar, if somewhat tragic figure. She had lived a deeply troubled life, suffering from epilepsy, developmental disabilities, and a host of strange compulsive behaviors. She often came across as simple, childlike, and in desperate need of protection herself. To the families and friends in her tight-knit community who hired her to babysit, she seemed utterly harmless. They saw her not as a threat, but as someone to be pitied, a person to help by giving her a small job. No one could have possibly imagined that this pitiable young woman was one of the most prolific and compulsive child killers in American history. The horrifying pattern of death began on a winter day in 1980 in the town of Blountstown. On her very first day on the job babysitting 2-year-old Cassidy Johnson, the child died. Folling gave a tearful, confusing account of how the little girl had simply stopped breathing. In the absence of any obvious signs of foul play, and perhaps influenced by a reluctance to suspect the seemingly simple-minded babysitter, the doctors ruled the death an accident caused by blunt trauma to the head, as if from a fall. Just 3 months later, in nearby Lakeland, 4-year-old Jeffrey Davis died while in Folling's care. Once again, she played the part of the distraught, unlucky caregiver. And once again, doctors found a plausible medical explanation, attributing his death to myocarditis, an inflammation of the heart. 2 dead children in 3 months, both in the care of the same woman. It should have been a screaming red flag, but the angel of death was just getting started. In 1981, the tragedy struck within her own family. Her 2-year-old cousin, Joseph Spring, died after she had supposedly taken him to the doctor for a viral infection. A few months after that, 8-month-old William Swindle died in his crib while Folling was babysitting. With each death, her performance of grief became more practiced, her story of being the unluckiest woman in the world more polished. The community, however, was growing suspicious. A dark nickname began to follow her, the killer babysitter. The truth was that Christine Folling was a cunning and methodical predator. Her preferred method of murder was chillingly simple and, for a long time, tragically effective. She would wait until she was alone with a child and then smother them, pressing their face deep into a soft blanket or pillow until they stopped breathing. She later called this technique blanket magic. It left no stab wounds, no bruises, no obvious evidence of a crime. She was exploiting the tragic mystery of sudden infant death syndrome to get away with murder, time and time again. Her final murder was the one that finally broke the spell. In July of 1982, 10-week-old Travis Coleman died while in her care. This time, the autopsy was performed by a medical examiner who was aware of the dark rumors that followed Christine Folling. He conducted a more thorough examination and found clear, undeniable evidence of suffocation. Tiny, telltale hemorrhages that could only have been caused by a violent, deliberate smothering. The police finally had definitive proof of a homicide. They brought Christine falling in for questioning, under the intense pressure of interrogation, and confronted with the irrefutable medical evidence. The unluckiest woman in Florida finally confessed. She admitted to killing not only Travis Coleman, but also Joseph Spring and Cassidy Johnson. Her motive was as bizarre as it was chilling. She told investigators that she had an uncontrollable urge to kill them whenever they cried or became fussy. She described hearing a strange sound and said she wanted to make it stop. But she also revealed a second, more narcissistic motive. She craved the attention and sympathy she received whenever a child died on her watch. It was a horrifying form of Munchausen syndrome, but instead of just making the children sick for attention, she was killing them for it. Faced with the death penalty, Christine Falling pleaded guilty to 3 counts of first-degree murder, though she is suspected in at least 2 more deaths. As of Saturday, August 30th, 2025, Christine Falling remains incarcerated at the Florida Women's Reception Center. She was sentenced to life in prison and has been eligible for parole since 2006. At every parole hearing, she has been denied, but the board, citing the horrifying, repetitive nature of her crimes and the powerful emotional testimony of her victims' families, who fight to ensure she dies behind bars. Her case is a horrifying look at how a serial killer can hide in plain sight, using a simple-minded facade and the world's pity as her camouflage. She was not a mastermind, but a compulsive predator who turned the act of babysitting into a hunt. The home daycare. For millions of parents, it is the perfect solution, a safe, nurturing environment that feels like a home away from home. Run by a loving, experienced, almost grandmotherly figure. You drop your child off every morning, believing they're in the safest possible hands. But what if that loving home is in fact a house of horrors? What if the trusted caregiver is a hate, black widow, and the string of mysterious infant deaths that seem to plague her are not tragic coincidences, but a horrifying pattern of murder? In the small town of Newark, New York, Diane Odell was a pillar of the childcare community. For years, she ran a popular and seemingly reputable daycare out of her own home. To the dozens of parents who entrusted her with their children, she was a lifesaver, an experienced, caring provider who had a special way with infants. Her reputation was spotless. Her home was a place of trust. But beneath the surface of this idyllic arrangement, a dark and terrifying pattern was emerging. One by one, the babies in Diane Odell's care were dying. The unraveling of her secret reign of terror began with the death of 3-month-old Andrew Lavasta in 1985. Odell claimed she put the baby down for a nap and returned to find him lifeless in his crib. It was a parent's worst nightmare, and at first, the official cause of death was listed as sudden infant death syndrome, or SIDS. It was a devastating tragedy, but it was seen as just that, a tragedy. However, one sharp investigator, aware of the whispers and dark rumors that surrounded Odell's daycare, refused to accept that lightning could strike so many times in the same place. He began to dig into Odell's past, and what he found was a horrifying history of death and near death that all pointed back to one woman. He discovered that another infant, a 4-month-old named Peter, had also died of supposed SIDS while in Odell's care just a few years earlier. The investigator then uncovered a chilling series of other incidents involving children who had suffered from sudden, unexplained episodes of apnea, a terrifying condition where a child simply stops breathing. Miraculously, those children had survived, but the pattern was undeniable. This was not a daycare plagued by bad luck. It was a hunting ground. The horrific truth was that Diane Odell was a serial predator. Her method of murder was as simple as it was evil. She would wait until an infant was asleep and then smother them, cutting off their supply of oxygen until they stopped breathing. It was a quiet, untraceable method that perfectly mimicked the tragic mystery of SIDS, allowing her to hide her murders in plain sight for years. The motive behind her monstrous actions was believed to be a chilling form of Munchausen syndrome by proxy, a psychological disorder where a caregiver fabricates or induces illness in those under their care to gain attention and sympathy. Odell seemed to crave the drama and the godlike power that came with a medical emergency. It is believed she would smother the infants until they were on the brink of death and then discover them, initiating a frantic effort to revive them and casting herself in the role of the heroic, life-saving caregiver. But sometimes, her sick and twisted game went too far, and the children she was torturing for attention would die. Her trial was a landmark case that hinged on the statistical impossibility of her claims. The prosecution argued that the odds of multiple SIDS deaths occurring under the care of a single, unrelated individual were astronomical. They brought in the parents of the other children who had mysteriously stopped breathing at her daycare, painting a damning picture of a serial abuser. In 1987, after a long and complex trial, the jury saw the pattern for what it was. They found Diane Odell guilty of murder. As of Saturday, August 30th, 2025, Diane Odell is in her 70s and remains incarcerated at the Bedford Hills Correctional Facility for Women in New York. She was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. She has been denied parole multiple times, with the board citing her refusal to take responsibility for her crimes and the cold, calculated nature of her predatory behavior. Her case is a terrifying reminder that even a long and spotless reputation can be a mask for a serial killer, and that the most dangerous monsters are often the ones who hide in plain sight, day after day. Every parent and every caregiver knows the universal challenge, the fussy, crying baby who refuses to sleep. It is a test of patience, a call for gentleness, for soft lullabies, and quiet rocking in a dark room. It is a moment that demands selfless care. But what if a caregiver decides to take a shortcut? What if, out of pure, unadulterated selfishness, they reach not for a comforting embrace, but for a bottle of adult medicine from the cabinet? What if they decide to turn a common, over-the-counter drug into a deadly poison, all for the prize of a few quiet hours to themselves? In a quiet suburb of Reynoldsburg, Ohio, the Mulkey family trusted Lori Conley. She wasn't a stranger from an agency. She was a longtime friend, a familiar face in their social circle, who had babysat their 8-month-old son, Haddix, on multiple occasions. They believed she was a responsible and caring person, someone who would treat their son as her own. This was a casual, everyday arrangement built on the simple foundation of friendship. That foundation of trust would prove to be a fatal miscalculation. The day of the tragedy began like any other. In May of 2016, Haddix's mother dropped him off at Lori Conley's house for the day, expecting to pick him up that evening. A few hours later, however, she received the phone call that is every parent's worst nightmare. It was Conley, hysterical, claiming she had put Haddix down for a nap, and when she went to check on him, he was cold, blue, and not breathing. The baby was rushed to the hospital, but it was too late. Little Haddix Mulkey was pronounced dead. In the immediate aftermath, Conley played the part of the devastated friend. She offered a shoulder for the grieving parents to cry on, all while claiming she had no idea what had happened. The initial assumption was a tragic, unexplained case of sudden infant death syndrome, or SIDS. For weeks, the family mourned what they believed was a terrible natural tragedy, with the woman responsible for their son's death pretending to mourn alongside them. But the autopsy soon revealed a horrifying truth that had nothing to do with natural causes. The medical examiner found a massive, lethal quantity of diphenhydramine, the active ingredient in the common allergy and sleep aid medication Benadryl, in the baby's system. The amount was so high, it would have been a large dose even for an adult. For an 8-month-old baby, it was a death sentence. This was not a case of SIDS. This was a poisoning. The investigation immediately zeroed in on the only person who was with Haddix when he died, Laurie Conley. When police confronted her with the toxicology report, her story of a tragic accident fell apart. She confessed. She admitted that she had given the baby an adult dose of Benadryl. Her motive was as infuriating as it was pathetic. There was no deep-seated hatred, no complex revenge plot, no psychotic break. She gave the baby a fatal overdose for one civil reason. She wanted him to go to sleep so she could have some peace and quiet. This was not a mistake. This was a conscious choice. Laurie Conley, a grown woman and a mother herself, was annoyed that a baby was acting like a baby. She wanted to relax, and the infant in her care was an inconvenience. So, she chose to drug him into silence, gambling his life against her own selfish desire for a quiet afternoon. The sheer laziness and indifference of her crime was staggering. She had treated a human life as a minor annoyance to be solved with a pill. Her trial was a brutal look at the deadly consequences of selfish negligence. The prosecution portrayed her as a careless and monstrously irresponsible woman who was well aware of the dangers of giving adult medication to an infant, but did it anyway because her own convenience was more important than a child's life. Her defense attorneys tried to argue that it was a tragic error in judgment, but the overwhelming amount of the drug in Haddix's system proved this was far beyond a simple mistake. It was a chemical assault. The jury saw it for what it was, a murder born from laziness. In 2017, they found Laurie Conley guilty. As of Saturday, August 30th, 2025, Laurie Conley is incarcerated at the Ohio Reformatory for Women. She was sentenced to life in prison, but will be eligible for parole after serving just 15 years. The Morkey family, who lost their son to her selfish act, now fights to ensure she serves her full sentence, forced to relive their nightmare every time her parole date approaches. The case of Laurie Conley is a horrifying story about the evil of indifference. She wasn't a cackling villain or a criminal mastermind. She was something far more common and therefore far more terrifying. A normal person whose selfishness was so absolute that she murdered a child for a little peace and quiet. Patience. It is the single most important virtue a caregiver can possess. It is the quiet strength required to soothe a crying child, the gentle perseverance needed to navigate a toddler's tantrum, the calm assurance that forms the bedrock of a safe and loving home. For a parent, trusting a babysitter is an act of faith. Faith in their patience, faith in their self-control. But what if that faith is catastrophically misplaced? What if behind the babysitter's friendly and capable demeanor is a reservoir of hidden, explosive rage? What if a baby's cry is not a call for comfort, but a switch that flips, unleashing a monster of pure, violent fury? In Fresno, California, Megan Martson was a trusted friend and babysitter. To the parents of 18-month-old Jaden Rose, she was a reliable and seemingly caring young woman they felt comfortable leaving their son with. She was part of their circle, a familiar face who had proven herself capable. They had no way of knowing that Martson was hiding a dangerously short fuse, a volatile temper that was completely incompatible with the stressful realities of caring for a small child. They trusted her, and that trust would lead their son to a brutal and agonizing death. The nightmare began on a day that started like any other. Jaden's parents dropped him off at Martson's home for the day, expecting to return that evening to their happy, healthy son. Instead, they returned to a scene of quiet horror. They found their son limp, unresponsive, and struggling to breathe. There were visible bruises on his small body and a terrifying swelling on his head. Martson, seeing the panic on their faces, immediately began to spin a web of clumsy, escalating lies. Her first story was that Jaden had fallen off a child-sized couch while playing, but the severity of his injuries made that explanation impossible. As the parents rushed their son to the hospital, Martson's story began to change. She then claimed that she had accidentally dropped him in the kitchen. When that lie didn't seem to hold, she added another layer, claiming that another child in her care had pushed him over, causing him to hit his head. The constantly shifting narrative was the first undeniable sign that this was no accident. This was a cover-up. At the hospital, doctors confirmed the parents' worst fears. Jaden's injuries were catastrophic and in no way consistent with a simple household fall. He had multiple skull fractures, massive brain swelling, and internal bleeding. The doctors knew they were looking at a case of violent, intentional child abuse. Despite their best efforts, little Jaden's injuries were too severe. He was declared brain dead and died a few days later. With the medical evidence proving a violent assault had occurred, police brought Megan Martson in for interrogation. Faced with the undeniable proof that her stories were lies, she finally broke down and confessed to the horrifying truth. There was no fall from a couch. No other child was to blame. The monster was her. She told investigators that on that day, Jaden had been fussy and wouldn't stop crying. Her patience, a shallow well to begin with, had run dry. Consumed by a blinding rage, she snapped. She admitted to violently shaking the little boy. Then, in a fit of pure, unrestrained fury, she slammed the 18-month-old's head against the hard floor, not once, but multiple times. It was a shocking confession of an almost unbelievable level of violence, a lethal temper tantrum from the very person paid to prevent them. Her motive was as simple as it was sickening. She was annoyed. A baby, for acting like a baby, had triggered a homicidal rage that she was either unwilling or unable to control. The trial painted a grim picture of her character. The prosecution portrayed her as a woman with a dangerous, hidden anger problem, someone who lacked the fundamental emotional maturity and self-control required to be around children. They presented the medical evidence as proof of the extreme, malicious force she had used. Her own lies, her frantic attempts to invent accidents to explain away the injuries, were used as proof that she was fully aware of her guilt. The jury saw her for the monster she had become in that moment of rage. In 2015, Megan Martson was found guilty of second-degree murder and felony child abuse. As of Saturday, August 30th, 2025, Megan Martson is incarcerated at the Central California Women's Facility. She was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison and will not be eligible for parole until she has served the full 25 years. This was not a case of complex psychosis or a diabolical premeditated plot. This was a story about the terrifyingly common monster of human rage. It's a brutal reminder that behind a calm exterior can lie a storm of violence, waiting for the smallest trigger to be unleashed. The case of Megan Martson is a horrifying warning that the most dangerous person you can invite into your home isn't always a cunning criminal, but the one who simply cannot control their own temper. Parents do their best to protect their children. They check references, they ask questions, they look for any red flag that might suggest a person is unfit to be a caregiver. But what if the darkest secrets are buried so deep they are impossible to find? What if the sweet, responsible young woman you hire is hiding a past so violent and so calculating that it includes a conviction for a murder-for-hire plot? This is the horrifying story of a killer who was hiding in plain sight. Her true nature is a monster revealed only after it was far too late. In the Boston suburb of Waltham, Massachusetts, the parents of 5-month-old Michael Needham thought they had found the perfect babysitter. Melissa Haskell was a 22-year-old local girl who came across as sweet, reliable, and wonderful with their infant son. They had done their due diligence, and she seemed like a perfectly safe choice. They had no idea they had just entrusted their child to a woman with a proven history of homicidal intent, a woman who had already tried to have someone murdered once before. The family's world was shattered on a winter day in February of 1991. Melissa Haskell made a frantic 911 call, claiming that she had put baby Michael down for a nap. and when she checked on him, he was blue and wasn't breathing. She told paramedics he must have choked on his formula. The baby was rushed to the hospital, but it was too late. For a short time, Haskell played the part of the hysterical, traumatized babysitter caught in a tragic accident. But the autopsy soon exposed her story as a lie. The medical examiner found no formula in the baby's lungs. Instead, the evidence pointed to a violent and deliberate act. There were signs of compression on his face and chest, and the official cause of death was asphyxiation. Baby Michael hadn't choked. He had been forcefully smothered to death. As police began investigating the seemingly sweet babysitter, they made a shocking discovery that turned a tragic crime into a tale of unbelievable evil. They ran a background check and uncovered Melissa Haskell's secret criminal history. It turned out that just a few years earlier, she had been convicted of a shocking crime, soliciting to commit murder. As a teenager, she had become obsessed with her ex-boyfriend and had tried to hire a high school classmate to kill his new girlfriend for the price of $500. The classmate went to the police, and Haskell was arrested and convicted. The authorities and the Needham family were horrified. They realized they were not dealing with a young woman who had snapped in a moment of frustration. They were dealing with a cold-blooded manipulator with a documented history of plotting to kill those who inconvenienced her. The motive for murdering a 5-month-old baby was believed to be terrifyingly simple. The infant was crying and fussy, and Haskell, a woman whose solution to problems was murder, became frustrated. Her response, colored by her inherently violent and depraved nature, was to silence him permanently. She held him down and pressed the life out of him, then invented the choking story to cover her tracks. Her trial was a sensational look into a deeply disturbed mind. The prosecution was legally allowed to introduce her prior conviction, painting a damning picture for the jury of a violent and manipulative woman who had tried to kill before and had now succeeded. Her defense, sticking to the debunked choking story, was no match for the powerful medical evidence and the shocking revelation of her murderous past. In 1992, the jury found Melissa Haskell guilty of first-degree murder. As of Saturday, August 30th, 2025, Melissa Haskell is in her 50s and is incarcerated at MCI Framingham, a medium-security women's prison in Massachusetts. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She will die behind bars. Her case is a brutal warning that you can never truly know the secrets a person is hiding. She wasn't just an evil nanny who snapped. She was a proven killer in waiting who was given the keys to a home and the care of a helpless child. It is a terrifying story about a monster who wore the mask of a babysitter, waiting for the chance to kill again. Rage. It is the most primal and destructive of human emotions. We have seen what happens when a caregiver's patience snaps, when the stress of a crying child ignites a fatal, explosive fury. But what happens when the rage has nothing to do with the child at all? What if a babysitter, consumed by a venomous and bitter anger at her own life, decides to use the innocent children in her care as nothing more than pawns in a gruesome war against her husband? This final, horrifying story is about the terrifying power of displaced fury and how a quiet suburban home was turned into a slaughterhouse by a monster of domestic revenge. To the outside world, life was perfect in the affluent Chicago suburb of Naperville, Illinois. It was a town of sprawling homes, pristine lawns, and a sense of absolute safety. Here, 40-year-old Elżbieta Plakowska, a Polish immigrant, was living a version of the American dream. She was a stay-at-home mother to her 7-year-old son Justin, while her husband, a long-haul trucker, provided for the family. She also regularly babysat for her neighbors, the Dworkowski family, and their sweet 5-year-old daughter, Olivia. She was a trusted, familiar presence in the neighborhood. No one could see the deep cracks forming beneath her ordinary suburban facade, or the toxic brew of resentment and rage that was boiling over, ready to erupt in an act of unimaginable violence. That eruption came on the night of October 30th, 2012. Plakowska was at the Dworakowski home, supposedly watching over Olivia and her own son, Justin, who was there for a playdate. The children were told to get ready for bed. A few hours later, Plakowska began making a series of bizarre and frantic phone calls. She called her church, rambling to a priest that intruders had broken in and that she was covered in the devil's blood. She called her adult son, telling him to come home, that something terrible had happened. When police were finally dispatched to the Dworakowski home to investigate a possible robbery, they walked into a scene of absolute carnage. What they found was a bloodbath of almost biblical proportions. The quiet suburban home had been turned into a slaughterhouse. In a master bedroom, they discovered the small, mutilated bodies of Justin Plakowska and Olivia Dworakowski. Both children had been stabbed dozens, even hundreds of times, with a savagery that shocked the most seasoned homicide detectives. The family's 2 pet dogs had also been viciously stabbed to death. Plakowska was found at the scene, covered in blood, with superficial, self-inflicted cuts on her arms. Her story of an intruder immediately fell apart, and she confessed to the slaughter. Her motive was one of the most shocking and selfish in criminal history. This was not about a crying child or a momentary loss of control. This was a calculated act of war against her husband. She admitted she was deeply angry with him. She felt he was a distant and unappreciative husband who was always on the road, leaving her alone to deal with the pressures of being a mother. That day, after a heated argument on the phone, her rage had reached its peak. To punish him, to make him suffer in the worst way a human being can, she decided to murder the one thing he loved more than anything in the world, their son. Her confession was a chilling, step-by-step account of the horror. She took 2 kitchen knives, walked into the room where the children were, and told them both to get on their knees and pray. Then, she began her frenzied attack. She stabbed her own son over 100 times. She then turned the knife on 5-year-old Olivia, stabbing her 50 times, murdering her simply because the little girl was there to witness the first killing. In a final, twisted justification, she claimed she killed her own son because she didn't want him to grow up in a world with a terrible mother like her, and she killed Olivia so her son wouldn't be alone on his journey to heaven. Her trial was a dramatic battle over her sanity. Our defense attorneys argued she was legally insane, that a cocktail of severe depression, family history of mental illness, and a recent death had triggered a psychotic break. They claimed she was seeing demons, and the end, evil eye. But the prosecution painted a very different picture. They argued this was a calculated act of pure, conscious revenge. They pointed to a chilling statement she had made to her husband. "You have your fun, now I will have mine." This wasn't psychosis, they argued. It was the ultimate act of domestic terrorism, using the murder of children to inflict emotional agony on her husband. In 2017, the jury rejected her insanity plea, finding her guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. As of Saturday, August 30th, 2025, Elżbieta Plakowska is incarcerated at the Logan Correctional Center in Illinois. She was sentenced to natural life in prison and will die behind bars. Her case is a horrifying look at how domestic rage can curdle into an act of evil that defies comprehension. A brutal reminder that the most dangerous monsters are sometimes created not by madness, but by the simple human poisons of resentment and revenge. From the explosive rage of a volatile temper to the cold, calculated poison of a diabolical plot, the stories of these 10 individuals represent the ultimate and most intimate betrayal. They are the guardians who became predators, the protectors who became assassins. Their crimes do more than horrify. They plant a seed of doubt and fear in the mind of every parent who has ever left their child in the care of another. They are a brutal reminder that the most dangerous monster isn't always a stranger lurking in the shadows, but can be the trusted caregiver welcomed inside our own homes. They are, without question, among the most evil nannies in history. If you found this deep dive into these shocking crimes compelling, please be sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on all notifications so you don't miss our next video.